Hello and thank you very much for joining us today on The Front Page, the show from the Racing Post that takes you deeper into the big stories in the world of racing. I'm your host today, Racing Post editor Tom Kerr, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by senior reporter Chris Cook. Hello Chris.
Hey Tom.
And remotely our deputy industry editor Peter Scargill. Hi Pete.
Morning, sorry I can't be there with you today.
Not a problem at all. As regular viewers of this show know, we're something of connoisseurs of chaos, and we love nothing more than to get our teeth stuck into a classic bowls up. And we had an alliterative one last week where there was a Brighton debacle, Brighton bowls up. And Chris, you're going to tell us more about it. Obviously, this follows hot on the heels of the debacle on the Downs in the Dash. Tell us what happened at Brighton.
Well, it was an admin error, evidently. We thought we had a 6-runner handicap. 6 runners not the best, but you know, it's just something to get your teeth into as a punter. And actually, I'd had a bet in this race, so I feel personal about it. And then about 45 minutes, less than 45 minutes before the race, it emerged that 4 of the 6 horses weren't going to be able to take part because they weren't actually qualified to be in the race at all. And they were sort of summarily ruled out. And this is a race that was timed for 4:30 p.m. So there's already been racing taking place. It just suddenly seems to have emerged in the middle of the afternoon that something had gone wrong. I think in the end we're going to find out that this was turned into a confined race, having not been one in the past, and that was probably where the error occurred. So the qualifying issue was that it was for horses. This time it was for horses that hadn't won more than 2 races. I don't think it has been that way in the past, and I don't think that was probably the intention. But anyway, that condition was imported into the conditions this time. And 4 of these horses had won more than 2. I think one of them had won an awful lot more than 2 races, and we were left with a 2-runner contest. Far from ideal. I mean, you've got owners and trainers who've travelled down there specifically for this race, and you feel for the owners in particular, because maybe they've taken time off their usual activities, and they might have taken some friends, they might have hired a box, having a good time. Here we are, having a luxury day, watching my horse at the races.
And just before,
at the last minute.
How long before was it?
It was less than 45 minutes.
45 minutes. And do we know how it came to light?
Yeah, so that is again something that I'm looking forward to finding out. I was making some phone calls to try and establish it. I think it may have been another of these instances where it's basically guys on the internet have spotted something that everybody else has failed to see, and word has sort of seeped out that way, and eventually by some circuit arrived at the steward's door. A similar fashion to, do you remember the Young Master when he sort of absolutely bombed up in the Badger Rails chase at Wincanton, a long time ago now, but of course it turned out he wasn't qualified to run. And I think fears on that ground had first been expressed on Twitter like 5 days before the race. So it just goes to show you that we should all be spending some more time online listening to what those guys are saying. The Snowfall Mother Earth mix-up in the Fillies Mile 2 or 3 years ago, that again, I think that was one where the sort of red flag was raised online, again I think through Twitter. So guys on the internet have been spotting things, and doesn't it make you feel like if we didn't have the internet, if we're winding back only about 20 years, we wouldn't be spotting stuff like this. That race would have gone ahead with the 6 runners. No one would probably have noticed. I phoned Brett Johnson, who trained the eventual winner of this Brighton race, 2 horses that were able to run, and his beat the odds, and asked him, because I had it in my mind, it might be one of the guys whose horse was qualified to run who's eventually sort of raised the alarm at Brighton. Because if you carefully sort of gone through the programme book and identified a race that's perfect for your horse, it's only for horses that have won less than 2 races, you think, all right, this is the one, and then you turn up and there's a bunch of horses that have won a load more than 2 races in there, you'd be miffed, wouldn't you? You might well go and knock on the steward's door and say, for goodness sake, take these horses out. But that's not what happened. He was unaware of the condition, and he pointed out that both his runners at Brighton that day, they appeared in the declarations in the race card with headgear that he had not asked for. Roscioli had nothing next to his name, whereas in fact he wanted a tongue tie, and his horse in the race after, Lucky Mascot, I think it was, was down for a tongue tie when in fact it was supposed to be a visor. And because eventually it was accepted that that was also an official mistake, he was allowed to run those horses with his preferred choice of headgear, even though that wasn't what had been published in the race card on the morning. So, there's mistakes being made, and you, as a member of the press, you want to try and be responsible about it. You don't want to inflame it and turn it into something more than what it is, but it does feel like we shouldn't be making these mistakes at all. That's number one. And number two, we're probably not even aware of all of the mistakes that are being made. For a sport with the amount of money washing around in it that ours has, it feels like we should be past this kind of basic stuff. And you worry that it's a deterrent, one, to punters and therefore spectators and enthusiasts, because you want them to know when they're looking at a card that the horse that's declared with a tongue tie is going to run with the tongue tie and not a visor that you hadn't anticipated. You want to know that 4 horses aren't going to be suddenly torpedoed out of a 6-runner race. You want that kind of certainty that the ground isn't going to shift beneath your feet. But also, it's a real problem if you're an owner and have this kind of experience. It's easily the kind of thing that might make you wander away from the sport and go and spend your money elsewhere.
Sort of chips away at it, doesn't it? And I thought it was fascinating because Alice Haynes was one of the trainers affected by this late recognition of an administrative error, who was also, of course, one of the trainers affected in the dash. She had the favourite for that race who was one of those who were released late from the stalls. And, understandable frustration. I think it was her only runner on Friday, this runner at Brighton, so, all the hopes sort of tied up in that. Okay, you can chalk that up to bad luck, and these things happen, and mistakes do happen, but she had a point, which I've heard made before, which is a understandable one, which is that if we do something wrong, we get fined. When the BHA makes a mistake, or Weatherby's make a mistake, there are no consequences, or there appear to be no consequences, perhaps more fairly.
Yeah, so they say sorry and the world's expected to keep on turning. Realistically, I'm sure nobody expects us to start finding individual executives in the firmament, or maybe they do hope for that, but I don't, obviously that's not realistic. I think there's always that sense, isn't there, that our officials who run the game are not held to account in the same way as the participants. We wait to see what the BHA and Weatherby's will make of this, but I'd like a pretty quick answer as to what's gone wrong here and why it won't happen again.
So they issued an apology, which is
but they
absolutely
had to do, there was no avoiding it.
And I think they said they would consider providing compensation for entry fees and transport costs. Surely that's got to be a minimum. You
would like to think so. I don't like that word consider. You want that to be taken as read, don't you? Brighton have, even though this is nothing to do with them, this is obviously not their fault. They've made a goodwill gesture of making some compensation to the people affected. Because as a racecourse, as a business, you want runners, don't you? And you want those people, obviously they are going to go away having had a bad experience, but you want to modify that. You want them to think well of Brighton. You want them to bring their horses back. But that's a cost to that business's bottom line, which again should not really happen.
Fault, no. Yeah, Pete, just to bring you in here, the impact on owners, I guess, listen, there is an impact on punters here, clearly, and if you're someone who's had a bet on one of the horses who were withdrawn, you're going to be frustrated. If you had a bet on one of the horses who were disadvantaged in the dash, you'd be entitled to be extremely irritated. But in this instance, it's the owners who have had their days ruined and potentially, are going to be left with a very sort of sour taste in their mouths, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. I don't know if I'm coming from a contrary position on this one, but I can't quite get behind the stance from the trainers that this is terrible administrative balls up by the BHA and Weatherby's, and they should have compensation thrown their way. I've looked at the race, the program book this morning. It quite clearly says it's for horses who've won no more than 2 races. Some of these trainers employ racing secretaries. There's a responsibility. It's a little bit like if I write an article and there's a mistake in it, and it's not picked up by the sub, for whatever reason, and it gets published. That's not the sub's fault, is it? It's my fault for making a mistake
Pete,
in the first place.
I think in that situation, you're well within your rights to complain to the sub. Do you not do that? That's what I do routinely when I make mistakes.
Well, there we are, Chris. Perhaps it's an example that I should learn to get behind the trainers.
Definitely. Look into it.
Absolutely. So I get if you're an owner, you're frustrated, but I don't know whether your ire necessarily should be attracted to the BHA, and whether yes, they have a responsibility to administer what's going on, and it should have been picked up. But the horses were put in the race by the trainers,
Sure.
and it's it's in black and white. It says for horses who've not won more than 2 races.
But so two points there, though. I mean, am I not right in thinking that normally when you get a race with that particular condition, it has the word confined in inverted commas in the title, and so once trainers get used to that, if it doesn't appear in the race title, then they're going to be potentially caught out by it, aren't they? And the other thing I was thinking from the trainer's perspective is, again, if your horse isn't qualified and you go to enter, don't you normally get a message saying your horse isn't qualified, which didn't happen on this occasion?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of the second one, yes, you will often get, a horse will come up as NQ on the bottom of an entries, and it's so that there's been an error in the administration in that sense. But equally, saying that it wasn't confined in the race title is, it's a bit of a weak argument, because it does say in the race conditions for horses who, it's like entering a filly for a race that's confined to colts, isn't it? It's the same
it's not
idea,
that bad, is it?
But it's you need to read the race
Peter.
conditions, man. You need to read the race conditions. So I think a gesture towards the owners is fine. I can see why they would use the word consider, frankly, when it comes to compensation, because I don't know, if you want to smooth things over, it's fine, but I don't think they necessarily need to be taking all of the blame in this instance. Sometimes it's not like the stalls incident where there was more of a reason to be annoyed because the horse's chance were compromised at the stalls at Epsom. There's got to be some personal responsibility on this one as well, I think.
Thanks so much, Pete. We're going to wrap it up there, guys. I enjoyed a disagreement, and I'm sure the BHA enjoyed as well, having someone take their side, which probably they would complain doesn't happen often enough. Before we move on to our second story, we are going to have a quick pause for this advert for Racing Post Members Club Ultimate. Okay, welcome back. On to our second story, and what else can we talk about in the week before Royal Ascot but the Royal meeting itself. And in the build-up to this meeting, and indeed the build-up to many meetings, the conversation is often as much about who is not going to be there as who is, and the last week has been no exception to that. We heard, first of all, a massive story as Frankie Dettori jocked Richard Kingscote off Desert Crown, and then in perhaps what some would regard as the quickest act of karma racing has ever seen, Desert Crown was ruled out of Royal Ascot with a minor setback. But also last week we had a very interesting analysis in the Racing Post about the International Challenge at this year's Royal meeting, and Chris, that's where I would like to start, because I think it's fair to say this has been one of the great success stories of Royal Ascot over the last 15 years or so. We've got a great graph which we'll put up on the screen now, which will show you how that International Challenge has grown over the years, obviously dropping off during the COVID times, but bouncing back strongly last year. Let's talk about, first of all, the international challenges who are there in numbers. We've got a good Australian challenge this year, several different trainers. US challenge is numerically strong, but also a lot of different trainers there. French trainers always come over in numbers. So it's a decent spread. It does have that international flavour. Ascot will be entitled to be pleased with those who are coming.
Definitely. I mean, in a way, it's sort of gravity defying, isn't it, really? Because we're always aware that the prize money that we offer in this country, while it's strong at Royal Ascot, it doesn't really compare with what you get in the best funded jurisdictions around the world. So, I mean, just to be able to appeal to that many countries simultaneously it shows you the prestige of the event, I think, and the fact that people just want to come over and take part in that. it's great to see Australian runners coming back in numbers, because they went through a significant drought. I think it was 10 years between victories before last year. After Black Caviar, which you wouldn't have expected. It looked like at one stage they were taking over the sprints, and they might be a sort of dominant force forever. And then we had a bit of a lull. It makes it more fun, and I think we've reached the stage now, taking a broader view, where actually, I hate to say it, but I enjoy Royal Ascot more than I enjoy the Cheltenham Festival, because that sort of competitive factor is just reliably there for pretty much every race at the Royal Meeting. Whereas, at Cheltenham, I'm afraid, unless action is taken, it's slightly dribbling away. Those races are not as hot as they used to be. Royal Ascot can be great fun again, and largely, at least partly because of the sort of exoticism of these horses that you don't know so well, or if you do know them, it's from sort of watching YouTube replays from 5 hours after the race took place in the middle of the night.
Yeah, which is part of the fun of it.
Yeah.
Although you say we don't know some of them, or certainly some of the trainers we do know very well. Wesley Ward is coming over. He's bringing 5 horses over. There's a stable tour with him talking through his runners in today's Racing Post, also available for Members Club subscribers online. But he's not the only US trainer coming over now, and I think in the US in particular, the atmosphere of Royal Ascot, the prestige of it, the sort of for them, I guess, the exoticism of this pomp and ceremony around it has really sort of taken off. But then again, also it's about the success Wesley Ward has achieved at the meeting, which has prompted people to think, okay, actually we can go over there and we can mix it.
His success, but also the sort of joy that he radiates from being part of this. I mean, I guess that derives from the fact that he's been winning at the Royal Meeting since like 2009. It's hard to believe. 14 years now he's been coming over.
He said his kids
sandbagging us.
who'd been coming there their entire lives, basically, with tiny little
I remember
babies.
From when they were tiny, and now obviously it's like an ingrained part of their history. And so of course, other people in American racing are looking at that and going, actually, that looks quite a bit of fun. Let's see if we can build this into our summer holidays somehow, and go over and make some memories. It's all about trying something new, and that's what the essence of sport is. Taking on something that's really difficult, going over to somebody else's country and beating them. If you can do that, then you've really achieved something. And you can't underestimate the importance of, we've had the NBC coverage, I think, for about 10 years now in America. And so that sort of helped spread the word about, about what this meeting is all about, and what fun it is to be part of, even if it doesn't bounce your way every time,
Another interesting trainer going to be represented for the first time, I think, is Kieran Mayer and David Eustace, who run a truly extraordinary operation in Australia. Somewhere in the region of 700 horses. Again, there was a really interesting interview with Lee Mottershead and David Eustace, who's, of course, a scion of British
part of British racing, really. I think we can claim him when he wins next week.
And he asked him about the numbers, and he sort of said, well, there might be 750, actually. I'm not. It's 50 horses here or there. Extraordinary scale of a training operation that they're running in Australia.
I find it hard to get my mind around that, because I think still in this country we think of 250 as being a really big number, to the point where you're having to delegate lots of things, and the trainer becomes more of a sort of general manager. The idea of 700 is just mind-blowing. I mean, that really gives truth to the old saying about it being a numbers game. Honestly, I'm not particularly comfortable with one operation having that number of animals at their disposal.
Well, it sort of goes to the point you were talking about around Cheltenham's lack of competitiveness, and it potentially leads you down a similar route. Now, Australian racing is very vibrant, and I don't sense has that sort of problem, but clearly when you start having numbers clustered in that sort of quantity under a single trainer, then there is a danger that they are going to sort of monopolise the top end of racing to an unhealthy degree.
I think that would be my fear. I mean, people hate this kind of talk, but I really think we should have serious conversations about, limiting the extent to which one individual training operation can grow. From the point of view of promoting competition, I think in the future we're going to have to set limits, I think, and that will have to be an international endeavour, or it won't work at all.
We're going to get a runner from Hong Kong for the first time for a few years. Great to see a representative from East Asia coming over. But the racing nation that everyone would like to see at Royal Ascot, I think, or the one that's certainly the one that's not there that everyone would like to see, is Japan. They're sort of the all-conquering international raiders de jour, but no runners at Royal Ascot. It's a tricky one. Nick Smith, the sort of Royal Ascot's recruiter-in-chief, if you like, goes around the world banging the drum for the Royal meeting. He certainly has done a great job. He was quite candid on the difficulties attracting them, the position in the racing calendar that it occupies, the attractiveness of both the Breeders' Cup and some of those Middle Eastern festivals early in the year, prize money, and also the record of Japanese raiders at Royal Ascot, which hasn't been great.
I mean, habits are slow to change in this game. We know that, from the way it operates here. So getting people to try something new is really difficult. You can be sure that once there's a big win, that'll change everything, and other people will be more interested. And you do see some change, don't you? Because it didn't used to be the case that Japan would sort of take part in the Dubai meeting at the start of the year to the extent that they do now. And it's got to the stage where they're routinely having success, and that's a really big deal for them. If we want them to be part of Royal Ascot, that change has got to happen at some stage. I'm sure Nick will keep banging the drum, as you say. But I mean, if you're a trainer in Japan, then you've got a busy season with lots of Group 1s available for you. Really well-funded sport over there. How tempting is it going to be to fly around the world and probably find an even hotter race for much less money? I mean, your standard trainer is kind of allergic to that sort of behaviour. So it's probably going to take an individual owner who just sees this challenge and goes, actually, I want to see if we can be the first to make this happen.
You wouldn't expect Charlie Appleby to do the reverse and send a runner who he's aiming at Royal Ascot over to Japan for one of their big...
I guess not, exactly.
Very unlikely.
Yeah.
So it is an uphill challenge. Worth mentioning, the Great Equinox is due out soon in Japan on the June 25th. We'll obviously have coverage of that with the Racing Post. Pete, just to bring you in here, let's turn to the Desert Crown drama. Obviously, it worked itself out in a way which was, I suppose, grimly predictable in the end. But what did you think of the decision to put Frankie Dettori up on the horse? Richard Kingscote, surely entitled to be pretty damn disappointed there.
Oh, I'm sure Richard would have been very disappointed. I mean, I'm a big fan of Richard. He's ridden for me before. I think he's an excellent jockey. He's a guy that kind of doesn't make mistakes very often, but he's a real good, solid jockey like that. And I think his record riding for Stouts and his record riding on Desert Crown backs that up. The difficulty is that Rich is in the position where he is essentially he's kind of like a number 2 rider already at Stouts, isn't he? Because Ryan Moore is there to take the rides if they're available. So, it's almost, he's given that ground already where somebody might come in to take the rides. And it's Royal Ascot, and it's Frankie, and it's his last Royal Ascot. And, it is a week where he is often at the peak. I mean, last year, being an exception, albeit he did come back from Stradivarius to win on Inspiral in quite magnificent style. So it's a tricky dynamic of where Richard stands within Stout's yard, but I don't think it's a reflection on his skills as a rider.
No, I'm sure it's Chris. You want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a complete one-off, isn't it? It's Frankie Dettori's last year. You don't often get a situation where you've got a whole season to sort of celebrate a jockey's imminent departure. Quite a few of them sort of let you know at the very last moment, or even after they've ridden their last winner. Because classically nobody wants to be thought of as that lame duck guy who's going to stop. That would tend to undercut your riding chances. But Frankie is different again for all sorts of reasons. And I nearly think that if we ended up with a Prince of Wales where he's watching from the weighing room, it would be a pity. You sort of think Frankie's last Royal Ascot, it's for us as well as for him, and we should be able to see him in the race somehow. I feel very sorry for the jockeys that, Richard obviously not going to be the last instance, I feel sorry for the jockeys that he will elbow aside through the rest of the year, but that is going to happen because, there are going to be owners and trainers out there who would quite fancy being part of Frankie's farewell tour and give him a chance if he doesn't already have one.
It's exceedingly tough though, to go and win a derby and then to get jocked off having done absolutely nothing wrong. It's a bit like scoring a hat trick in the FA Cup final and then getting put on the bench for the Champions League final.
Yeah, well, you're taking me out of my comfort zone there, but I suppose that has happened probably to different guys. It's just sport, isn't it? For most people, there's ups and downs, and you just got to try and take the rough with the smooth. Certainly in public, Richard Kingston does as good a job of that as anyone I've seen. And to some extent, Frankie does as well, because, you only got to go back to Royal Ascot last year, and he was having a pretty torrid time of it. And we think of him as a confidence jockey. I was afraid at the time that would really knock him, and, he might not bounce back for a while, but I mean, when he came back from his sort of little holiday that he took after that, he started having winners more or less immediately and pulled himself back. And now here we are in the situation where he's 52, 53, and flavour of the month once again, Group 1 double at Epsom. He's fully entitled to go out with a bang, with lots of good chances at Royal Ascot. And as I say, I feel sorry for other jockeys, but this is going to happen. And from the sports perspective, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Will it be a fabulous Royal Ascot for Frankie Dettori? We will find out next week, and I hope you'll join us at the Racing Post, because we have an absolutely packed schedule of coverage, much of it on YouTube. Watch this video to have a look at what is coming up next week. Make sure you subscribe to tune in for all the shows.
Royal Ascot is fast approaching, and here's what's coming your way from the Racing Post. What a Shout kicks things off on Monday the 19th of June with Dave Orton and some of the Racing Post top judges taking you through their best bets for Royal Ascot week. A double dose of the Racing Postcast with Tote Fantasy. That's right, Sam Hart kicks the week off looking at the opening 4 days alongside some of the Racing Post top tipsters, and Friday to give you those Saturday winners. Wake up every morning of the festival at 9 a.m. with Good Morning Royal Ascot. David Jennings, Paul Keeley and some of the Racing Post's top personalities will preview each and every day. In the Know returns to your screens, brought to you by Coral, with me, Ross Briley, Paul Keeley and Pricewise himself, Tom Siegel, live from 6:30 p.m. every night, previewing the next day's racing, finding those winners, angles and strong opinions. It's an action-packed week and it's not to be missed. Subscribe to the Racing Post YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing.
Welcome back. We're going to go to Pete for our final story. Pete, you've been following the dramas at the Professional Jockeys Association. There's been plenty of changes of personnel there, plenty of unrest from their members, the jockeys directed towards their representative organisation. What are the latest developments and what do they mean?
Yes, I'm interested to see where we are in terms of the drama, whether we're nearing the end of the drama, whether it's the middle of the drama. I'm sure that'll become apparent in the weeks ahead. But so we know that the chief executive, Ian McMahon, was ousted at the end of last month. They've got a new board members. They've got a new chair, and we learned this week that Paul Struthers, the former chief executive, and Pete Burrell, Frankie Dettori's business manager, have been brought on as consultants. So they're not coming in to fill positions as such. A lot of people were calling for Paul Struthers to take back the role of chief executive. They've come in as consultants to help with specific issues. Burrell's on sort of commercial matters. It's not specified what Paul Struthers will be doing, although he has been speaking a lot about the whip. So it wouldn't surprise me if it's got something to do with that. But no, two interesting developments in terms of people coming on. But I mean, I know this is something you're interested in, Tom. I just, bringing in two consultants sounds quite expensive. And I mean, this must have been a quite expensive period for the PJA, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I looked up their finances on Companies House the other day, which is the sort of fun way I pass my time. And they have a very healthy, or had a very healthy 600 grand cash sort of reserve. I wonder what that stands at today, given the number of individuals who have exited and now entered the organisation, all of whom I'm sure will have depleted that cash reserve in some capacity. So it's clearly been an expensive period for them, and we'll find out in due course just how expensive it's been, I'm certain. You can't say they've really achieved much for that. In fact, if anything, they're in a much worse position than they were, albeit now hopefully righting the ship with their new appointees. Paul Struthers is the most interesting one because there's obviously been a lot of talk about him potentially coming back as chief executive, having formerly served in that position. if you follow Paul on Twitter, he's a very, very interesting chap, and he's now working, he's doing a sports consultancy. But he's been tweeting a great deal about the whip. I think from some people's perspective, he's maybe been on more manoeuvres than the Ukrainian army, and I think it's fair to say that he has been sort of positioning himself as the voice that the jockeys did not have on this issue, which is obviously causing a great deal of unrest in the weighing room. Justifiably so, I suppose, when you look at some of the numbers that are sort of floated, by Paul. He's saying that in the 9 weeks since the new whip rules regime was applied to both jump and flat racing, there have been 202 suspensions handed out, totaling 1,169 days. Paul's point, and I think this is shared by a lot of people in the weighing room, is that those numbers do not fit the crime. What do you think, Pete, and how do you anticipate that his return to the PJA fold will influence their campaigning on this issue?
Well, the whole changes at the PJA seem to be about communication to me. But communication was obviously something that dropped off a cliff under the previous regime. I mean, we didn't hear from the chief executive, Ian McMahon, nearly at all. There was a PR consultancy that we heard from very little as well. So, you've got Nick Attenborough in as the new chair, a guy that's got great experience in racing, someone who's already stated a desire to be more open with people. Paul Struthers, a great communicator, someone that the jockeys get on extremely well with, someone who knows how the inner workings of the BHA go, not only from his role at the PJA, but from his role at the BHA. They've got many more board members now. I think part of the reason for that is that they know they're not going to get all the jockeys together at once. So clearly they want to communicate their position better publicly, but privately as well. And Paul is coming in with a very clear understanding of how he feels the whip has impacted people. There are a number of bans, there are significant bans. We know that enhanced bans were part of the changes that came in January, and you have to imagine there's going to be some lobbying going on. And there's been minor changes to the whip rules all through the year so far. I would suspect there'll be quite a lot more lobbying going on now that Paul's back in the plate.
And Chris, I suppose there's just sort of two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, you can say the leadership of the PJA has been pretty shambolic. On the other hand, there is perhaps a legitimate argument that jockeys have not engaged as thoroughly with their representative organisation as they might have done, and therefore, when rules have come in, that's the point at which concerns are raised, rather than being articulated and flagged much earlier in the process.
Yeah, I mean, that again is related to how strong and effective your leadership is. My mind goes back to that interesting moment when they managed to talk the BHA out of banning using the whip in the backhand position. Remember, we were going to distinguish between backhand and forehand, and it just felt like they were so grateful to get that knocked on the head. The message from the PJA or from the jockeys at that stage was, right, okay, well, thanks for that, and now we're happy with everything. We're going to try and make this work. I think if Paul Struthers had remained as chief exec throughout that whole process, it wouldn't have ended up like that. He'd have still been saying at that point, well, thanks for that, but by the way, these sentences you're bringing in are way too harsh and they're going to really mess up some people's lives. It's taken time for that message to sort of emerge over time. As we're seeing, as you said, the number of suspensions that are happening. And I feel there was sort of some early, if you like, complacency. Just the whole process of the whip rules being changed, I think, has not gone anything like as well as it should have done, or as effectively as it should have done, and would have done had Paul remained as chief exec throughout the process. So I mean, it's in a way it's the sports loss as a whole when the PGA is not well led. And the message I'm sure they'll take away from it is that they need someone in charge who knows the sport intimately and can, it doesn't need to be briefed about what's bothering jockeys. We'll just feel it in their bones. We'll understand it perfectly.
Just finally, on the whip rules as they stand and the level of suspensions, or the length of suspensions rather, does it need to change?
Yeah, I think it does, really, out of all fairness. I mean, I understand the point, everybody does, that we want to make it clear how serious whip offences are, but people are being punished excessively harshly, and to the point where it really has got out of proportion by comparison with, say, interference, which, I would say is much the greater mischief. We've seen a couple of examples recently of, behaviour from jockeys on the track that really, we should be coming down on very hard, and the punishment is days, and the verdict is careless rather than something more significant. I've been banging on about this for a long time, as have other people, and it has felt like officials are not really interested, but they need to start focusing on that. And maybe if we hadn't been sort of caught up with the whip over the last 18 months, we'd have got to that before now.
It does feel disproportionate. Yeah.
There's a disconnect, isn't there?
Yeah,
when you can get like nearly 2 weeks, is it, for going twice over the limit? I mean, you shouldn't go over the limit with the whip, obviously. But that's no excuse for just leathering somebody. I think it's the technique ones
that they have more concerns with, because there are some quite almost esoteric sort of offences which a layman would not really necessarily know how to even interpret visually, never mind understand the significance of, and those are attached to very lengthy bans as well. And,
without giving time to respond is the one that's tripped up some people unexpectedly. And to begin with, there was the over shoulder height thing that seems to have calmed down. There's been a sort of experimental, exploratory aspect, I think, to this whole regime change in the whip, which has not been very helpful. I suppose maybe you could, from an official's perspective, you'd say it was inevitable. That's why we had the bedding in process. In some form, I'd say the bedding in process has kind of continued.
Yes.
The whole thing has been a live experiment for several months now. I'm afraid that the punishments are not fitting the crime, that's for sure, and therefore you would think in all justice, at some stage, it should be revisited.
Thanks very much, Chris. Let's wrap up. What's going on the front page? I don't think anyone wants to see the whip on the front page, so we're not going to do that. No, indeed. Royal Ascot, of course, you can't get away from it, but on the basis that we have had such a string of debacles recently, and that they are obviously something which is of sort of such concern and indeed interest, we will go with the Brighton Bulls up as to this week's front page. Congratulations.
It's a great decision, if I may say so, Tom. But I mean, you've got to think that although this was a low-profile race on this occasion, in the future it may not be. It'll be by God's good grace if we get through Royal Ascot without any sort of similar hiccups.
Well, on that note, do come back and join us in a fortnight's time when we will have an in-depth roundup of all things Royal Ascot. We're going to take a week off next week. You saw earlier we've got a full slate of shows over Royal Ascot week. Please do tune in for that. Loads of fantastic coverage of all the action, great tipping, great content all around. We hope to see you then. Just very finally though, I'm going to leave you with an advert for a fantastic competition where you can win tickets to go to the Breeders' Cup in Santa Anita later in this year. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.